Okay, so I wanted to address a few things here. You saying about how I'm not a contralto because I don't sound like one. Well, half the people that are actually considered contraltos by your standards wouldn't sound like it either. I mean, you want someone who has literally the same chest voice as a tenor. Every description of a contralto has actually been a little bit higher than tenors, and I never got why, because I always was like, to me, from my personal experience, it kind of seems like, for my voice, I have a lot of similarities to tenors. And I still honestly do have a lot of similarities. I do notice what you're saying about the whole chest thing. My chest is more so in my third octave and my second octave as well. My second octave, though, is just not something I really sing out of. And there's another thing about tenors. Tenors, if you listen to what a few things about tenors, they generally don't sing that far into the second octave. Usually A2 and B2 are the common ones that they sing, but many of the time they say that baritones actually are A2. It depends on the chart. So, that, is also that whole aspect of it. Sometimes people expect tenors to actually sing from the C3 to the C5. So that would actually include most of my tessitura. And the way I sing, I can sing into the second octave all the way to G2 and F2. It's usually F flat 2, actually. I just never really paid attention to whether it's F flat 2 or F2. Who really cares at that point, in my opinion? Um, but the point is, you know, I do notice there's a difference between the contralto and the tenor from what people are specifically putting out there. Um, One, specifically, tenors, they're supposed to sing falsetto after C5. Contraltos are supposed to go into head at D5. So, tenor's voice type is so much honestly lower than a contralto if you think of it. In that regard, as far as their passageways. My passageway would be actually in between the two. So my um, second passageway is at A4. That's higher than the tenor, but it's significantly lower than the contralto, because my passageway is at A4, theirs is at, D5. And mine does change throughout the month. Sometimes it can be C5. But it's in the A4, B4, and C5 region, depending on what time of the month it is for me. Because females actually change their voice during their periods and stuff. Anyway, but I always know by C5 I'm completely in head no matter what time of month it is. That's why I always say C5 is my thing. So, I kind of found it interesting that you were trying to make the tenors and the contraltos exactly the same. I think what's going on with contraltos and tenors, the overlap that we have, is the fact that there's a tendency with contraltos to be the same as the bass, basically. We're the female version of the bass. And so bass have the tendency of singing in their chest voice. Contraltos have a tendency of singing in their chest voice. This makes a lot of sense to me because in my family, we have heavier voices, deeper voices. And my grandmother has her voice from her father, who has a very deep bass-like voice. So, as far as this goes, it would make sense that contraltos and bass are kind of like related. And so they sing kind of like in their chest region. If you look at the contralto voice type, the tendency is to sing in the chest, right? So the chest voice is below a D4 for a contralto, right? If that's the case, it wouldn't be too much of a surprise if most of the tessitura lies more in the chest voice. because that's where we're most comfortable singing. That means that it wouldn't be a shock if we really sang more like from A3 or G3, for example. And in my case, I sing from F3 to F4, basically, in my tessitura. So that wouldn't really be shocking. I'm a little bit lower than contraltos in the passageway, so it wouldn't really be that shocking that my comfortable notes kind of straddle that first passageway, if you think of it, because I'm from F3 to about F4. And my passageway is around, I would say it's around the B3, C4, or possibly, I would say it's about the B3 or C4 area, basically. So that would kind of make sense that it's basically straddling my middle voice, so to speak, and my head voice. If you're a contralto, you have a tendency to sing in your chest. So then you're going to have more of your tessitura in the chest rather than in the middle voice. Now, if you look at tenors, I was looking at their voice type, basically. Their middle voice basically centers around their tessitura. So they have a different voice type, right? That's going to be an overlap because it's from an F3 to a G4, which is right in their middle voice, basically, instead of their head voice. See, tenors don't have a tendency of singing in their in their chest, because they don't have a similar voice to bass voices. They have a different type of voice, while contraltos have a similar voice to bass voice types. So that's why there's an overlap with tenors and contraltos. While our passageways, I guess, are different. And I can see that there's more similarity for me with the contralto type of passagios. Now, I wanted to look at this basically as far as some of the examples that were given of contraltos, Iwapado and, for example, Judy Garland. Both of these women I relate to, especially Judy Garland. As much as I hate the lady, okay? But I've always related to her voice type, okay? Honestly. You can hear there's some androgyny at the end of her chest voice, but most of her voice is not very androgynous. It's not light, and it's not deep. It's not heavy. It's not really heavy, and it's not really light. It's just kind of like in between kind of situation. So for me, in my personal discernment, I could definitely see that there's more similarity with these two. I understand when you talk about the dramatic contralto, that's a very different situation going on there. Amy Winehouse, her voice type is supposed to be more of a darker contralto. And I don't know, to me she confuses me because she sometimes to me seems like her tessitura is higher. So, and she probably does have a higher tessitura, honestly. Sorry. But, you know, as a contralto, I guess it ranges from what I've heard. With contraltos, you don't have one set voice type, so you can actually have it a little higher or a little lower, but basically the passageways are going to be similar, at least. And the mezzo-soprano, you were talking about mezzo-soprano passageways. You tried to say it was A4. It is not A4 for the second passageway, it's E5. That's a very high note for me, very head. There's nothing else in there but head voice for me. I've completely gone into head at that point. It's not a transition point for me at all. It's more of a, it's just a point where I'm just basically, trying to sustain a head voice, which is hard for me, and it's hard to sustain. I can't sustain a head voice very long. I can't sustain anything past an F4, honestly, very long, because it's just too much up there, honestly, in my opinion. as far as there's a passageway, then the head voice isn't my best thing. Honestly, my middle voice isn't the best thing, but the head voice is. There's so many different problems to my head voice, I always have to check it twice over. And then my middle voice, like I said, I can easily stave that off with my chest voice. And that's another thing about mezzo sopranos. Specifically, they were talking about how a mezzo soprano's head voice and their chest voice isn't supposed to go past an F4. My chest voice goes way beyond an F4. It can be belted up much higher than an F4. I can belt all the way up to about a C5, and sometimes I can belt up to a D5. This is dependent on my the time of month again, because certain times of month my chest voice is very strong, and then other times of the month my chest voice isn't as strong. With the belts, basically. I would say my chest voice is always the strongest component of my voice, though. Head voice is really... I didn't really get that until I was older, honestly. It took me a couple years to actually recognize even how to try with head voice. Chest voice has always been kind of like my home, and head voice is kind of like transportation, like, kind of situation. Also, another thing to point out is mezzo soprano first transition is E4. My first transition is not E4. It's at best D4, but honestly it's lower than D4. It's more like B3 and C4. Those would be my main transitions in the first passaggio, but I really don't pay attention to it until I get to the second one. Now, one more thing I wanted to talk about was showing the whole thing here, because, see, you were basically saying that there were passaggios that were lower for mezzo soprano and soprano. So I wanted to show different links showing how it works for mezzo soprano and contralto. They all have much higher notes than what you're trying to say here. For one, soprano's chest voice starts at G3 to E4. That's where it's like that's where the chest voice is for them. My middle voice starts around B3, so that's not far from a G3. Okay, it's around B3 to C4, somewhere around there. Middle voice is around E4 to F5, F flat 5. Very high F5. I really have a hard time singing in any capacity at the high F5 and the G5. Those are my struggles. Like, there's struggle, and then there's struggle. Like, it's really hard to really manage that. Only if you're trying to... I can sometimes sing it when I'm singing Rolling in the Deep. Sometimes. But that's... I don't even know how bad that sounds, honestly. But yeah. My head voice is definitely not F5 to C6 at all. My head voice starts at C5. For a mezzo soprano, it's more relatable, I guess you could say, starting at E3 or F3 to E4 to F4. My chest voice would start somewhere around consistently G2 or F2 all the way up to about I would think the D4 or B3, somewhere around there. Oops. And their middle voice starts at around C4 to F5 or E5. That's more relatable, but like I said, it ends at E5. My middle voice doesn't end at E5. And then their head voice is like F5 to B5. I can't even do B5 or A5. Those aren't my notes. I end at G5 and I start at C5 for my head voice. So that definitely isn't, it's like they might have some similarities when it comes to the lower end, but the higher end is so extended that it's not really the same thing. Contralto seems more relatable, honestly. Look at this. With contraltos, they're D3 to about a G4 or A4 for chest voice. Then middle voice is around F4 to about D5. And then their head voice is E5 to A5. It's just kind of higher, honestly. Because I mean, like, all the way to the E5. I mean, I change over at C5. My head voice is completely changed over at C5. My middle voice is changed over completely at D4, definitely. I would say it kind of starts in at B3, but you could say D4 at least is completely finished over to mid voice. You could even say maybe C4, but yeah, if we were trying to make it on the higher end, it would be D4. And then the head voice being E5 to high A5. I don't really sing A5 at all. I stop at G5. And my head voice starts at C5. So that way, I'm still lower than the contralto when it comes to all the passagios. But I would say it's still close enough when I compare it to tenors. I think it's better and it's closer to contraltos than tenors. I know you think that tenors and contraltos are the same, but there's no chart that actually has tenors and contraltos the same. They're just similar. And I think what's most similar about us is the tessitura. This is why I notice with baritones even, their tessitura is even similar to some extent. This is why contraltos can sing with tenors similar songs, because of the tessitura similarity. But that doesn't mean we have the same passages. No place is saying that a contralto actually has the same passages as a tenor. It's saying that it has different passages in mezzo sopranos and different passages in tenors. But we have similar tessituras, possibly. Even though most of the places I've seen with the contralto tessitura is higher still. But I think that maybe they're including people who have a higher tessitura, and there's lower tessitura for certain contraltos. That's what I'm thinking is going on there. Also here, was the last part of what I wanted to add into this video was, what did I want to add here? This page was important for something. Oh, they were saying how you can't narrow a middle voice for a contralto. I think that's what they said here. And